Hello, everyone. Hi there. Hello and welcome to today's event. My name's Kamna Patel. I'm an Associate Professor in the Development Planning Unit here in the Bartlett and our Faculty Vice-Dean for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion. Today is the first of 4 events marking Black History Month in our faculty. This is the first time that at the level of the faculty we are marking Black History Month. This is only our starting point, and I hope that our programme of activities and events will grow every year. So tomorrow we have a Q&A with the director of The Uprising, a documentary on resistance to racism across Europe from singer-songwriter and anti-racist activist Pravani Bowaram. Wednesday, we have a conversation on speculating cities and landscapes through queer, trans, intersex, asexual, bisexual, people of colour art practices with Amma Josephine Budge and Ruhul Abdeen. And later, we have a series of 4 podcasts with UCL's Urban Lab on Black urbanism, a rich, theoretical vein that I expect will enrich all our work. I'd like to thank the team who are putting this on and other events, particularly Sarah Rolfe, Liz Griffith, Abby Luter and Jordan Rowe. Special thanks to Janhavi Innes, an incredibly talented Black British woman who designed the artwork for Black History Month in the Bartlett. Today, we are here to launch this curriculum, Race and Space. Now, I hope and I think that for our academic community, we have surpassed the point where we need to make a case for why race matters, why Black lives matter, why racialized minorities in making their homes, their lives and their children mired in racism and whiteness matter. If there was any doubt on the mattering of race, the spring and summer of 2020 should have dispelled them all. From my home in London, I followed keenly developments on who contracted and died from COVID-19, and I felt my heart sink at every turn. Whether a patient or doctor, Black and brown people died at a higher rate than anyone else. The ugly scepter of race science popped up and was easily indulged in trying to explain why Black and brown populations were susceptible. It's their diet, or perhaps some as yet unidentified genetic feature. Last Friday, the ONS, the Office for National Statistics, issued an update on COVID-19 deaths and ethnicity. Its overall conclusion states, our findings show that ethnic differences in mortality involving COVID-19 are most strongly associated with demographic and socioeconomic factors, such as place of residence and occupational exposures, and cannot be explained by pre-existing health conditions. Place of residence and occupational exposures. It is not who we are and what we eat that will kill us, but where we live and where we work. From my home in London, I bore witness to the murder of George Floyd and the protests in US cities that were a catalyst for renewed public outrage in the UK and the deaths in custody of young Black British men like Kevin Clark, ongoing cases for justice like for Belly Mujinga, and reparative justice to the memory and spaces claimed by Edward Colston and his ilk. The commemorations of empire that colour our cities form the backdrop to these protests, and not only in terms of the feat of protesters passing through city centres along Victoria Street and to face down Churchill in Parliament Square. As an educator, the rallying call that stays with me from Black Lives Matter actions across the UK and written on numerous burdensome placards carried on the shoulders of our young people is, Britain, you are not innocent. Now, why would anyone ever think we were? I'd like to focus the rest of my remarks on why it is that we have made it so difficult for people to learn a fuller account of our cities and the determining role of race within them. We, educators, teachers, gatekeepers to knowledge, and knowledge producers, what projects of unlearning, repositioning, and empathetic teaching must we engage in to fruitfully interrogate the spatial form and race? So this curriculum, Race and Space, is first and foremost a pedagogical project, an unsubtle statement of pedagogical intent. We, the curators, want you to think differently. This curriculum started life in October 2019 in a room in Tavistock Square with Solomon Zawald, a newly minted doctor from the Institute of Education, Adam Walls, a PhD student in the Bartlett School of Architecture, Tanya Sengupta, Associate Professor in the Bartlett School of Architecture, Catalina Ortez, Associate Professor in the Bartlett Development Planning Unit, Yasmina Bibijuan, Associate Professor in the Bartlett School of Planning, George Burridge in the Bartlett Faculty Office, and myself. We started by asking ourselves, where is race in my discipline? Where is it in the canon, in new theory, empirical research, research methodologies, and pedagogy? And then where do I begin to introduce or advance analyses of race in the built environment? The journey of answering these questions led to this curriculum and the curation of a wide range of resources from art, sculpture, music, novels, poems, alongside journal articles and books. We've curated these resources to inspire and encourage engagements with race as a productive analytical lens through which we as scholars and educators can see our cities and our towns anew. We suggest that recognizing the ways in which race and racism is enveloped in the built environment is an intentional and deliberate exercise in unlearning and relearning. And so it is somewhat tongue-in-cheek when we ask, and with a nod to Professor Gloria Ladson-Billings, that we ask, just what is race doing in a nice field like the built environment? We will now hear from 5 speakers invited from industry and academia on the question of what is race doing in a nice field like the built environment. Everyone will speak for about 10 minutes. And audience members, I encourage you to use the Q&A function, not to ask questions, but to share your own experiences of race and built environment education. If you would rather speak than write, please raise your hand after the last of our speakers has spoken, and we will unmute you and so we can hear your voice. Our panelists will be reading and listening to your contributions and will share a few final thoughts and reflections based on them. Please do remember that this event is being recorded, and so share only what you are comfortable with sharing. So I should like to invite our first panelist, former Bartlett student and head of design at Resolve Collective, Akil Scafe-Smith, for their response to this question. Resolve is a design collective that combines architecture, engineering, technology, and art to address social challenges. They've delivered numerous projects, workshops, publications, and talks all over Europe that aim to realize just and equitable visions of change in our built environment. Akil, over to you.
Thanks so much, Kamna, and thank you for having me on this event. I think it's a really pertinent one, and you know, like everyone who's been here, I think we've all witnessed and we've all bore witness to the events that have precipitated a lot of the things that are going on now, and also more importantly, kind of precipitated a lot of the talk and the discourse that I think is now coming to the fore. And that's not to go against the kind of years and decades of work that's gone into that, but to kind of acknowledge the moment at which we're on and to acknowledge the need to capitalize that moment. So I think for those reasons, those compound reasons is why a talk like this is something that's kind of extremely apt of its time. So I think in terms of responding to the question of what race is doing in a nice feel like the built environment, I think when I first saw the question, it was perhaps the purpose of the question, I felt provoked. The question is a provocation, and I felt provoked. I felt like, firstly, I think the word nice is the kind of obvious one in there. When you see it written down, you see nice in kind of inverted commas, and so I kind of immediately felt like, okay, well, what exactly is the juxtaposition doing there? And I think that there were a number of different avenues I wanted to explore in thinking about not just why the nice was there, but why did it annoy me that it was there? Why did I have that initial response to nice being there in this question, which I think I felt as a person of Afro-Caribbean descent living in a huge city, that this for me was less of a question and more just of a kind of accepted reality. And so thinking and mulling over it and having the time to do so, which I think is another one of the kind of the unintended consequences of everything that we've collectively been through, is kind of having a great deal more time to do certain things and to think and reflect. I kind of went back and forth about exactly what would be meaningful for me, and not just for for anyone, for another Black practitioner in the built environment, for a scholar of Black lives in the built environment, for any number of identities that could have addressed this. I thought, what would be pertinent to me, Akil, who's sitting in his studio in Custom House, quite hungry at the moment. What would that mean? What would be beneficial for you guys to hear? And so I felt like really for me, it would be more of a reflection, not on the juxtaposition of nice and race being in the built environment, but really of the fact that they're in the same sentence. And I want to talk more about how things are conjoined rather than how things are separate. And again, what I don't mean is that in a kind of unifying, let's hold hands and dance on a campfire type way. What I mean is the conjunction of the built environment, the espousing of racial capitalism, and the lived realities of those who live through that constructed idea of race is really, I think, how I would like to get to the crux, or how I ended up reflecting on this question. And Ruth Wilson Gilmore has a fantastic quote, I mean, more of a phrase really, that continues to kind of stick in my head. It clings to my head. Whenever I'm thinking, whenever I'm doing something, whenever I'm walking around, it often pops up. And she says, capitalism requires inequality and racism enshrines it. And the more you kind of think, it is exactly that kind of quote, that the more you think and the more you practice and the more you do, the more you really understand. And there are so many layers to it that I think it's something that it will never be got to the bottom of. Quite like the provocation we're at the moment kind of discussing, it's not something that we get to the bottom of. And I think that when we think of the built environment, as practitioners, as academics, as people who live and engage with the built environment, what we must understand, and I think rather than what we must understand, but something which I think is integral to how we move forward and integral to solving issues of inequality or inequity, be that racial inequity, socioeconomic inequity, etc. Is to understand the conjoinment, to understand the complicity of the built environment with structures of racial capitalism, and to understand that complicity and to understand that inherent conjoinment isn't necessarily to it doesn't necessarily involve it doesn't necessarily involve the type of activism that we've seen out on the streets. It doesn't necessarily involve Black squares on Instagram. It doesn't necessarily involve having a PhD in racial capitalism. It doesn't really involve any of that. I think there's a plenum in which we can recognize how people engage with all those things, and a plenum in which we recognize the benefits and the detriments to any type of engagement. And I think what I would like to really kind of hone forward is that to think about race in the built environment is to think about this complicit nature of the built environment and the creation of racial structures. How that race is created, that race is something that is structural but also structured, is a question that is inherently urban. For me, that's a question that's inherently architectural. And I think and when we start thinking about this question is when we can start thinking about what race is doing in the built environment, in a nice field like the built environment, because race is the field of the built environment and vice versa. I think that when we think of the project of capitalism as being inequity, we think of the tools of capitalism as having to be architecture. How do we create spaces through which inequity flourishes? How are spaces created through the flourishing of inequity as well? That it's a double ring that rings true to that. And so by practicing architecture, and I think that's something that we all on this call do in some way, shape or form, be it through teaching or kind of active involvement in the profession, or by being practitioners in the built environment, it's about thinking about that double clause. It's about thinking about the spaces which are created through inequality and the spaces that require it. And how we engage with those spaces, how we deconstruct those spaces, how we use those spaces, how we masquerade in those spaces, how we dance, how we enjoy, how we express our disdain, how we become activists in these spaces, I think are all such integral questions, and not necessarily questions that we need to provide the answers to. So sorry, I feel like I've gone on a bit on a rant, but I do, to hone down, I do really think that in what I would really like to express in terms of how we address this question, and it's something that I would like to continue talking about further, and it's something that I hope is expressed in my work, and I hope is something that people see as evident in not just my kind of professional life, but also my personal life, is that the question of race and any question to do with the built environment are one and the same, and that the built environment as both a product and a tool of capitalism, which requires inequality, in this, and is enshrined by racism, is necessarily married to any question of race. And I get to go back to Ruth Gilmore as well, and just to corroborate that, I think it's also worth understanding that race as a category, and thereby the tools by which we can construct race, also don't necessarily involve a certain race. So the category of, racial categories exist without those who are racially categorized. And I think, so in that we can understand how the segregation of place-based and social housing, for example, is also necessarily a racial question. How we can understand how kind of social housing tenures, how we can understand all a kind of a plethora of questions in the built environment, many of which don't always concern any particular race, right? Many of which don't always concern any particular race. But how we understand them as a racial question is how we understand those two factors. Space is the tool for which, space is something as a product of inequality, and space is something that requires inequality. How we can understand those two at that conjunction, how we can understand where those two things can join, and then where we can start to kind of practice and converse and nurture the tools which we need to deconstruct that. And it's only through that we can do that. I think it's only through this greater understanding, this understanding of how these things are conjoined, how and it is how we are going to be able to work our way out of that collectively. So those are my reflections on the question of race in the built environment. I think just like any response to any question with race in the built environment, any response to any question on racial capitalism, I don't think it's necessarily straightforward. I think it's actually always it's necessarily the acknowledgement of something quite complex, and necessarily the acknowledgement of something that doesn't have a straightforward answer, and perhaps doesn't have an answer, but through which we need to try and refine our questions, through which we need to try and refine our practices in order to continually address this, to perpetually address it. And I think I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Akil. I'm going to now turn to our second speaker, Neba. Our second panelist is Neba Sarah, the co-founder of Black Females in Architecture, BFA. BFA is a network and enterprise founded to increase the visibility of Black and Black mixed heritage women and non-binary professionals within architecture and other built environment fields. Neba is an architectural designer and a senior project officer at the Greater London Authority. Neba?
Thank you, Kamna. I think I'd like to approach the question by showing you BFA's journey, and then also how our BFA members have been in conversation with us during the past few months and weeks during this strange time of the pandemic, and as Kamna outlined before, the Black Lives Matter movement that became global. So I'm going to share my screen. Is that working for everyone? Yeah, great. So as Kamna said, we are a membership organization, a network of almost 350 members globally. And I think to approach the question, somehow I need to respond with why BFA exists. And if you're looking at the stats within architecture profession, we understand that there's an issue, specifically looking at a city like London. We have statistics that are 95% white, 75% male, and 97.5% from advantaged backgrounds. So the things that Akil spoke about earlier, race and socioeconomic background are inherently interlinked. So the reason why BFA exists is because we are here within the profession and we enter into the profession as Black women, but we don't necessarily make it through in the traditional way. We don't necessarily come out of the other end. And in architecture, that means doing your path 3 and becoming an architect. So there's a massive drop down of people from minority ethnic backgrounds entering part 1, and then a drop down in terms of coming out at part 3. So we have to ask ourselves, what happens in this journey that sometimes takes 10 years? Like, why are people not coming out as architects? And that means, sadly, the people who have a drive to enter into this profession, who could potentially become very, important and giving architecture a culture and identity that I think it desperately needs, those people aren't necessarily staying and practicing within the built environment. So the 4 co-founders, we met at an industry event a few years ago, and we were in shock that we met each other at an industry event, which is quite sad, because that means that we didn't expect to see another Black woman in an industry event. So that created BFA actually by chance, and we now have a great team of about 14 people, volunteers who work with us. Yes, and these are all women that are at different stages in their lives and careers. Some of them are students, and they all bring their skills and experiences to the organization. It's a voluntary organization, and they really make BFA work. We have different departments that either put on events or marketing, or to make sure that Black women are seen within the profession online. And as we are a digital platform, our online presence is extremely important. So the events that we are doing, we actually have two types of events. We are events that are really looking inwards at our BFA members, and these exist to be able to create a space for each other to be able to talk about the things that are really difficult to talk about, that you aren't necessarily able to do in your own context within the profession. And that might be in your educational surrounding or within your professional environment. In our social internal events, sometimes we realize there are things that are actually systematic and things that we all experience, which stops us from either progressing or from, being able to move to the next step in our career. So wherever we are within the profession, there's these things that make it more difficult for people like us. Then we also have industry events that are inclusive, and these are moments where we feel that the topics that we are addressing need to be heard in the industry. So we had 2 events recently with the Architecture Foundation called Decolonizing Architecture. And those were a really good moment to actually make a claim within our environment and say we need to diversify our profession, otherwise we are not able to respond to the needs of our society, especially living in a city like London. And I think this is what BFA really does. We highlight Black women within the profession, and we make sure that we are seen. So one way that we're doing that is make sure members are also receive opportunities. So Leah was part of a panel at Design, which was really great. I think all of us have issues to do with self-confidence. I had that myself in university, but I think by supporting each other, we are able to develop skills together to be able to step up and become more confident and speak up in panel discussions and things like that. And actually, Leah, really enjoyed this. So I think it's a great opportunity. What we've also recently set up is a BFA donations pot. Because we are a voluntary organization, we want to make sure that our members are actually remunerated for their time, work and labor. And often within our industry, that is not the case. Unfortunately, often there's an expectation for you to rock up to things and do things for free. And BFA can't really support that because, as I said, we are a voluntary organization. So we now have a donations pot, which people have been supporting in a really good way, which allows us to pay our members for their time that they give towards opportunities that aren't paid. And those opportunities are often for charities or smaller organizations who aren't able to pay our members, which we still want to support those. So yeah, the donation spot is up and running. And yes, I think this is the main thing that would probably help us discuss the question. During the pandemic, we had 2 BFA events called Unwind with BFA, which were really an opportunity for us to come together and discuss things that we were thinking about during the pandemic. And obviously, it was positive and negative things came out of there because many of our members were in the moment of graduating during the pandemic, and they were having really difficult times because obviously many of them were really implicated by the pandemic to the point of maybe even losing a family member, which was absolutely horrible. And to find out that the universities weren't supportive of them, they weren't even able to extend their deadlines or take time off. I think those things were kind of uncovered in our conversations. So the question really is, what is race doing in an environment like, a university? It's there for some people, and that's why tutors and teachers and the faculty really has to develop a sensitivity to be able to understand those connections, specifically for members who are implicated in the worst way. So I think the other things that we discussed were looking at our members who are within the work environment. The same thing happened really during the pandemic. Their employers or their colleagues, they didn't necessarily check in with them or, to find out how they're doing. I think there's a lack of empathy sometimes, even that you don't necessarily check in with your, with people who you see it on the news. Some people are more implicated by the pandemic than others. So where's the empathy of actually, asking how people are doing? That's the simplest question, I think. So I think just to summarize, the main things that came out of those 2 events were many members who are students feel a lack of support, thinking about the next step of after graduating, like what can I do when I graduate, where can I go, specifically when you don't have any networks within the industry, when you're the first one in your family to study or come into a built environment profession. So lack of support as to what can you do next, and then also thinking about possible career paths. So there is so many things that you can do within the profession, environment, the built environment profession. You can become an architect, of course, if that's what you want to do, but you can become a planner, you can do so many things, and I think we don't discuss all the possibilities that you can do with a skill set being educated in architecture school. I think being able to look at placements or work experiences, I think passing on those opportunities is extremely important. And as I said, we don't necessarily have a network, so being able for students to meet industry professionals is extremely important. I think, also access to digital spaces. So having tutorials online doesn't necessarily work for everyone. You don't always have, hardware, or, you might not live alone. You might share your room with your little brother. All these things that don't help you during your professional or the career development and university development are extremely important. So I think we asked our members the question, do you think your university has provided you with enough support to be successful at your studies? And over half said no. I think we need to disseminate that. And I think that's not necessarily just for BFA members. I think asking our students during the pandemic and, Black Lives Matter movement, if they felt supported on a virtual platform would be quite interesting. And I think looking at the fact that, I think I discussed the things before. So there were 2 quotes here. We've actually had to really push just to get our deadlines moved. was one comment. Another comment, connecting students, particularly those without connections from their parents, with professionals for internships opportunities more directly. So I think those are the key things that I think, yeah, were important. I feel like I will respond to the question in a bit later, just to hear comments from the audience as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neba. I'm going to turn now to our third speaker, Professor Haim Jacobi. Haim is an architect who specializes in critical urban studies and urban health in the Bartlett Development Planning Unit. His research, teaching, and activism focuses on post-colonial architecture, planning and development in Israel, Palestine, the Middle East, and Africa. He is particularly concerned with spatial justice and urban health, and his work illuminates how history, power, and structural inequalities of class, gender, and race interact to produce urban health disparities. Haim?
Okay, thank you very much, Kamna. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for posing such a provocative question, which really helped me to rethink some of my previous work, which I would like to share with you. So I think that
Haim, you've muted yourself. Can you unmute?
Sorry. What I would like to present today is some projects, research projects that I was involved in during the last few, 2 decades actually, and to show that race and space are linked in different levels. Some questions that were asked before: who builds and for whom? Who are the builders? Who are the architects? Who are the users? I think another point that I would like to highlight is how lived spaces, which are socially and politically constructed, mark racial and ethnic boundaries. I would like to highlight the role of power relations and how they are translated into white superiority and how they are reproduced through the built environment. I would like to mention the blackness and whiteness in relation to the built environment, and to ask, how can we transfer ethnic and racial gaps into urban regimes of division today? So I would like to start with a very old project, which is based on my PhD. I worked on Jewish-Arab mixed cities. The term mixed cities refers to cities that both Palestinians and Israelis, Arab and Jews, share the same urban space within the Green Line. These are the exceptional because Israeli space is very segregated. And one of the documents that I found mentions how the people who live in the Sakne, these are the remains of the Palestinian city of Lod, where Jews were settled in order to Judaize the space and in order to make the city from a Palestinian city into a Jewish city. The discourse around the presence of these people was very racist, I would say, mentioning, issues of sanitation, mentioning issues of crowdness, etc., etc. And some of these documents were also accompanied by the photographs that you see that documented what has been mentioned in documents as the ghetto of Lod, the ghetto of this specific city. So what you can see here is how racial categories are not just created between Israelis and Palestinians, Jews and Arabs, but also within the Jewish community. And that's what I would like to highlight. You can see how the remains of the Palestinian city and how the quality of the built environment in a way created also racial hierarchies within the Jewish community. Here, obviously, the reference is to Oriental Jews, who came from Arab countries and were settled by the state in this city. And obviously, it echoes very much Frantz Fanon's description of the colonial city. The same thematic or the same themes, the same issues that Fanon mentions are mentioned over and over in relation to the spatial history of this city. So we can see how the issue of race is constructed and what kind of link is created between the quality of urban space and the people who reside there. Another project, which is much more architectural or architectural history project, has to do with the role of the Arab village as a very central element if we want to understand the history or the transformation of Zionist architecture from 48. And here you can see how the Arab village is a very central, I would say, on the one hand, object of desire in a very Orientalist way, as you can see here from a photograph of Maasir Yanko, who was an architect and artist who really saw, the beauty of the Arab landscape, obviously without Arabs after 48. But at the same time, the Arab village in Israeli popular discourse is also considered as a target of military action. And here you can see an image from the Netflix series, which I guess that some of you have watched, Fauda. So what we argue in this article is that the Arab village as an object of desire, but at the same time as an object of destruction, is very central. And throughout the years, you can see how different architects refer to the landscape, to the built environment, the Palestinian built environment, either as a site of destruction or a site of, romantic and Orientalist object. And I just want to mention that it is important to mention that the people who, for example, or the builders who built Israel till the 80s, till the 90s, were Palestinian workers, of course. And they had the technological, traditional knowledge to rebuild, in the style of the Palestinian landscape, but also they were the first group that was kicked out after the first Intifada, the Palestinian uprising, and today Chinese and Thai builders are replacing them. So you can see how the political economy of architecture is very central to mark environments as racially, if you want, particular, but we must understand that within the context of settler colonial architecture, as I would argue, you can see that this is, there are two parallel processes: destruction and mimicry and Orientalism. Another project, which is completely different, has to do with the arrival of African asylum seekers to Israel. The presence of the Black body in the Israeli urban landscape existed before. And I'm talking about like 15 years ago. But since the arrival of African asylum seekers and their presence in Tel Aviv, what I would argue is that we are witnessing a process of racialization of urban space. And here I refer to the work of Balibar, who really managed to put his hand on the way in which race or racialization are not just about the biological differences. This is very much about the way in which we give priorities, hierarchies, and how we rank these hierarchies. And, again, I will not be able to go into details, but the presence of Black African refugees and asylum seekers in Israeli cities in general marks, as I would argue, a very crucial time in which we can start discuss urban space and race in Israel. In another project that is linked somehow to the previous one, I was trying to investigate how comes that Israeli architects, planners, and development experts were very, very dominant in Africa during the Cold War. I don't want to go into details, but what is very interesting to see is how Africa, as a geopolitical concept, not just as a territory, as a geopolitical context, was used as a way for Israeli experts and the Israeli public in general to whiten themselves and to make Israel Western, modern, and white. So this is my main argument in this book. And here, I'm very much focusing on the notion of moral geography, how we justify, on the one hand, our intervention in Africa, and how, at the same time, this intervention also help us to define our identity as white, modern, etc., etc. And finally, my current project, which focuses on, I will not go into it because my time is over, which focuses on the Neo-Apartheid city, where I claim that we can see how the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, from an ethno-national conflict within colonial context, of course, how this conflict becomes a racial conflict. And here I refer to the case of Jerusalem, and my argument is that Jerusalem became a neo-apartheid city, a city where the logic of division is not just spatial or territorial, but it also has to do with a notion of racial capitalism, the use of Palestinian power, but at the same time excluding them from the city. And what I'm trying to show is how, from a discourse of enmity between Israelis and Palestinians, we are witnessing a process of racialization, how from a state project, we see how the neo-apartheid in Jerusalem is operated through private organizations, NGOs, etc., etc. And actually, what I'm trying to show is how this new regime of division is very much based on the notion of race. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Chaim, and excellent timekeeping. I'm going to turn now to our fourth panelist, Danna Walker. Danna is the founder and director of Built by Us, an award-winning innovative social enterprise which exists to actively champion greater diversity and inclusion in the construction sector. Danna has previously worked as an electrician and an architect. She is currently a board member of public practice and a former trustee and board member for the Architect Registration Board. Danna?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's absolutely a delight to be part of this. And I'd like to start just by thanking actually Kamna and the team for putting this together, not only in terms of this event, but this essential piece of work. I started my architecture journey back in the 90s, and how I wish we'd had something like this as I went along that journey. The question that we were all posed today really had me thinking about my sort of personal experience in terms of how I've interacted with the built environment, how that led to the things that I've done in my career, from electrician to social entrepreneur, and to the work that I do now. So I'd like to share that with you. It's very difficult, and I think Akil put this beautifully earlier, to look at race without thinking about the economies at play, about power, about class, and about ownership. The sector does not reflect the society that it serves, and I do think the architecture of the built environment is about serving society. And that means that the unheard have the built environment happen to them. They are really part of the conversation. They are not asked to enrich or be part of the debate. And that seems to me like a ridiculous situation to be in. And in the 21st century, to still be talking about this seems like quite an odd thing. My career as an architect was not predicted. And that's mainly because of background. So I can remember the first time I started to think about the idea of being an architect and being looked at critically by my colleagues who were electricians, and thought that was quite an odd thing even to go to university at that time. From my family, who didn't really know anything about the built environment. Nobody in my family had been in the built environment other than myself. We were from a low income family, and being Black, Afro-Caribbean, it also meant that the connections to that world, to that language, to that network were completely non-existent. However, the built environment was having a huge impact not only in terms of its physical presence, but also in terms of the policies and beliefs around the culture of architecture and the built environment. So it was impacting me personally. Being part of a low-income family meant that as a child, and this is not me trying to say this is the typical kind of upbringing of someone like me, but we encountered homelessness, which meant that I went to 4 different primary schools, which meant I experienced different types of living conditions: prefab, squatting, bedsit, flat. The time where we had an opportunity for a permanent home was when my mum, along with her friends, started to form one of the early housing associations. So they got together and started to talk about how they could have autonomy, how they could take control, how we could have better lives for themselves and also for their children. I didn't know all of this at the time. All I knew is that all of a sudden we were in a house where I suddenly got my own bedroom and I didn't have to change school anymore. We had something permanent. We had some sense of ownership and autonomy. One of the things that I remember very clearly as a child was understanding that the world was segregated and that the built environment was part of that. It was always very strange to me that at school, when we were asked to draw what a home was, we'd all draw the same house with the 2 windows and a picket fence, even though none of us lived like that. And for many of our cousins and friends, they lived in local authority or social housing, where autonomy, where choice was not a reality. But when we all drew that house, that's the house that we drew. For me, architecture, culture, and history makes tangible things that are not said in polite society. It makes tangible what society thinks about who belongs, about who has power, about what is celebrated, about what is valued, who matters, and why they matter. And in terms of history, I was part of a debate on the BBC talking about race in our public space. It was clear to me, and becomes even clearer as we're going through this incredible time of reflection, that what we experience as history, culture, architecture is often a kind of Disney highlights package of things that the powers that be would like us to see and understand, and not to dig deeper. Architecture is a form of slow language that is constantly reflecting our past, our present, and talking about our future. So it occurs to me that if as a child back then in the 70s and 80s, I understood what segregation meant, what it is, and how it manifests in the built environment, what are the children of today learning? What are we teaching them? What are we showing them? It seems to me that architecture offers a huge opportunity to make change, which has often been squandered because we think that talent comes in a very particular package and it has a particular look, race, class, etc. All of this has really influenced my desire to make change and to start Built by Us, which is a social enterprise. And we exist to try and create a more inclusive built environment. Niba showed some brilliant slides about the levels of diversity in the sector. Diversity is part of it, inclusion is the other. Organisations like ours, and sorry, pardon the fire engines going off in the background. They always do this, they know I'm on a call. But part of the reason to have the diversity is not just about work and study. It's really about being able to be part of those conversations and being in places of power and influence, being able to sit at the table, being able to challenge the decisions that are being made by people who often don't have a lived experience of being in social housing, of being in places that are diminished and dismissed as ghettos, as slums, etc., etc. It's extraordinary to me that those decision makers will put the most vulnerable people in sometimes the toughest areas with the toughest challenges. One of the other hats that I wear, other than being involved in public practice and Built by Us, is a design reviewer. And each time I see a design review, and particularly one that focuses on housing, where you have an element which is private and an element which is social, the social is always placed in the most difficult area of the site, where the train tracks are, where the noisy road is, where the views are poor, without having a much wider talent pool within practice. The chances are we will keep repeating the mistakes that have been made before. There's a huge danger, and I think again, Niba highlighted this beautifully, that as we move into what looks like yet another economic recession, one that's going to be deep and possibly long lasting, that we will lose a whole ream of talent that's coming through at the moment, as well as some of the more established practitioners. Through Built by Us, we too offer support for individuals, but we're also working with practices so that they can better understand their obligations, responsibilities, and for those who really want to aspire to make change, to support them to foster that change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Danna. I'm going to turn now to our fifth and final speaker, Professor Christoph Lindner. Christoph is an urban and cultural theorist with a particular interest in socio-spatial inequalities, and he is also Dean of the Bartlett. So in these roles is in a position to bring to bear acute attention, resource and intellect to race and space in built environment education. Christoph?
Thank you, Kamna. Thanks so much for including me in this event. And I also want to thank the other panelists. It's been very inspirational listening to your insights and your experiences. And in a way, I have this privilege of going last. So having had a chance to get all of your really powerful words and thoughts on this big question, what is race doing in a nice field like the built environment? So I've been thinking, as you've all been talking, about what I can add to our conversation. And I think one of the things I'd like to say is that having this kind of conversation is precisely the goal of this curriculum. So the curriculum that's been devised here on race and space is designed to support our teaching staff in thinking about how they can bring issues of race and racialization more actively, explicitly, consciously into our teaching and our pedagogy. And why do we want to do that? And there's a whole number of reasons, and a number of them have been raised already this morning. But I think one of the key reasons is because we're clearly not having enough of these kinds of conversations in our classrooms and in our studio. And we're not asking enough of the sorts of questions that have come up today in our research inquiry and in our critical and creative practice, those that flow from the institution. So thinking about this from the point of view of someone who has a certain responsibility to our academic offering, as well as a scholar myself, I think that part of the question I'd like to address is a word that no one's touched on yet, the word field. So what is race doing in a nice field like the built environment? And I think that word field, like all the words in that question, is very, very loaded. One of the reasons I think the word field is loaded is because what it evokes is a whole clustering, a whole constellation of disciplines and the expertise, the knowledge and the methodologies that go with those disciplines, which together constitute this zone of exploration that we call the built environment. And why is that loaded? Because of the way that we've institutionalized fields at universities, whether it's the built environment, the humanities, the social sciences, engineering. All of these fields have been institutionalized. But I think there's a really specific critique that we can and have leveled at the field of the built environment, which is the way that it's been historically constructed at leading Anglo-American universities, and the Bartlett is part of this, is that it's been constructed in a way that is more exclusive than inclusive. And that's been to the detriment of everyone. So I really embrace this curriculum because it doesn't just invite more critical self-reflection and more collaborative conversation around issues of race, and through that allow us to see and understand race and the way in which it's spatialized, and how space itself also contributes to constructing race and the inequalities involved. I think that's a big part of what the curriculum does, but it also gives us tools. It gives us a way of enacting that. And so there's an element of practice and action involved in the curriculum that I think is very powerful. And trying to be a good student of the curriculum, I reread the book yesterday, and I wanted to share just one passage that really jumped out to me. And it's on page 11 for anyone who has the PDF or the book with them. And it's the introduction to the curriculum. And this is the statement. And I think it's a very powerful statement, and I think it's a correct statement. We cannot understand how space works and for whom without understanding race and racism. We cannot flex our power as teachers, practitioners, and students of the built environment, nor tackle spatial inequality without understanding race and racism. Space is a key agent in racial ordering, so if we change space, we can change the ways that race is performed. And I find that statement so profound because it both identifies what has been a problem, a blind spot in the field we call the built environment, but it also identifies a way to address that and to change that. And then finally, a page or two later, page 13, there's another claim about what the curriculum does, and I think it's worth calling out. This curriculum aims to decenter whiteness in our imaginations of the built environment and to positively disrupt curricula that perpetuate racialized disparities as neutral, natural, and normal. And again, I really embrace this. So looking at this curriculum, listening to all of the panelists and the insights about space, about racial capitalism, about the importance of unlearning and relearning, what it says to me is that we have some very serious work to do at the Bartlett. And we have some shortcomings and some blind spots to acknowledge and to deal with. But we also have a tremendous amount of expertise and energy that connects not just across our students and our staff here, but also out into the world of practice and out into society and out to community groups and organizations that we can activate to make the curriculum we want. And so in a way, I guess this would be my end point, is that race and space as a curriculum is about inspiring and helping to change a much larger set of curricula that exist right across the Bartlett. And I think that this text and the tools and the ideas and the readings and viewings it contains are relevant to every program we teach in the Bartlett. And I think the effects of reading this curriculum and enacting it in our teaching, in our practice, in our research, is going to be to the benefit not just of our students, it's actually the key to our future success. How much of our world within the academy, looking out into the world, how much have we not understood, not seen, not heard, not recognized because of our lack of understanding of race, our lack of acknowledgement of the role that race plays in constructing our spatialized social realities. And I would suggest that there is so much we don't know and don't understand, but that we can if we want to. And ultimately, that is how I interpret a curriculum. A curriculum is an expression of the collective priorities of a group of academics. And so the beauty of a curriculum is that it can go in any direction you want. It can ask any questions you want. It can tackle any problems you want. We can study whatever we want. So we just have to want to study differently. And I think that's a healthy thing in an academic community. So my ending point is simply to say, I love the idea of unlearning and relearning, and we should be doing that all the time in all of our programs. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christoph. Thank you all for your comments. And builders have just started drilling right next to my head. So if you can hear a noise, I'm sorry. I'm just going to carry on anyway and hope for the best. I'd like to ask our audience members if anybody would like to share their own reflections. I know you've been commenting in the misnamed Q&A. Please continue to do that, but if you would like to speak your contribution, then please raise your hand and we will unmute you. Or Abby will unmute you. Sade? Abby, can you unmute, please?
Oh,
Hi.
hi everybody.
Hello.
So to be distracted. Oh, I'm so happy to be part of this. I'm so grateful. And just as the dean had said, everything said by each of the speakers has been so impactful, and the historical perspective provided by Haim was also very spot on. But most importantly was the comments made by the dean and talking about the curriculum, and everything just came together in my mind, because there's always been this, the conflict. So my experience of race, or my perception of it, is that the whole world itself is segregated. So it's, and then as the dean said, it's, institutionalization of disciplines. So, and then the concept of space, fundamental economics, had alluded to that. The concept of limited resources. So resources had always been limited. And if you look at life and places, space is always limited. So there's never an overabundance of space, So even in America, if you look at it, as big as everything is, you still find people homeless. So it's both literal and metaphorical, the concept of space. So having said that, I think our ancestors and people who lived before us just felt that in order to control space, you need to have power over another person. Can you guys see me? Oh, no. Oh,
We
you can see me.
hear you. You can hear you.
Okay. Okay, so I think that is what happened. To control space, to have access to control that limited resources, you have to control power. So the concept of power asymmetry then began. So power asymmetry is what we're trying to resolve today in every discipline, in every place. For me, I didn't come from a wealthy family, and it's not because my parents didn't want to be wealthy. It was a philosophical and a thing. It was a principle that integrity matters above all things. And I was born in Nigeria. Nigeria is not a country where you should be like that. You miss out in everything. So so I grew up with that consciousness, and as I explored academia and everything, like all my siblings were very bright at school, so we were destined for great places. But as I progressed and I saw my power to attain and achieve, but I can never forget that fundamental principle of my parents who were smarter than me and the choices they made. So when I began to engage with power asymmetry in society, I wanted to do good, and I felt that I have to, for certain reasons I can explain, for posterity. So one of the things I just want to say here right now, and what brought me into the race rhetoric or the race discourse, is that thing that as a Black person, when you are in great places, when you get to be amongst the princes and those who control power in society, sometimes education can take you there, like disciplines like architecture for females. Growing up, architecture is one of the disciplines that is really very exclusive, even in Africa. You have to be very, very focused and brilliant. You have to have 2 degrees to be an architect in my country. You can't have a first degree. You have to have, it was so serious. And when I see women do that, and then you come out and someone wants to look at you like you're inferior to a man, there's a problem there. And this is not just the Bartlett, it's really far-fetched in society. So it's a disservice to humanity when Black people are seen as trying to be what they're not called to be, as trying to be what they're not, because they are in great places, rubbing shoulders with great people. And you hear comments and all these things like you're trying to be who you're not, but you already had that. And some people don't know that probably you had power and you have access, but you chose a different life. So it's not, so I just want to get it out there that conflict that you get as a Black person, when people misjudge you and do not understand you, is part of the conflict that come in, and really change the discourse, because people really don't understand your intent that you're probably trying to help. So I feel that I cannot just be incurious and ignorant of the consequences of this. And that is why I'm so happy that the Bartlett is, because I listen to people, I listen to the content of their words, and this is not just anything that you're just doing for show. I think it's very fundamental. I think there is really that call to honor, and you taking that leadership. And I really, really, I want to say that I'm proud of this department and of the dean's effort. And Kamna, thank you so much. I'm sorry you can't see me.
We can hear you. Thank you so much, Danna. Thank you for your reflections and for your contributions. We've got 2 more hands up. Abby, can you help? 3? Please, when you're speaking, can I ask that you keep your comments a little bit on the short side? I want to get through you all, but I know that we're running out of time. So please just help me out.
I have unmuted the next person. I'm afraid you haven't got a name. It's UCBQFB1. You are able to speak.
My UCL email. Anyway, my name's Faz. I've just started my part 2 at Bartlett. I'm a British Pakistani from Manchester. And first of all, I just want to say how thankful I am of conversations like this happening. And, you know, at first I was very kind of skeptical that a lot of people are going to be having these responses to George Floyd's murder and, you know, and the Black Lives Matter movement just purely for the sake of covering their own backs as organisations. But I do feel as if though progress will be made in the future due to conversations like this happening. Anyway, I wanted to actually speak upon my experiences in practice, and so I'm part of the youth board at Manchester International Festival, and we, as a group of young creatives, have come together and we started this conversation for change, which was getting the directors and the CEOs of top arts organisations in Manchester and the Northwest to have the discussion on race and on a response of holding them accountable for their institutionalised racism within their organisations and kind of the positive change that they'll make in response to the circumstances that we're in at the moment. And I then took that same conversation to my workplace. So I worked at an architectural practice in London. I'm not going to say who, but it was quite a profound architecture company. And I took the same conversation there because they also posted the black square on Instagram on the 3rd of June. And 3 months later, near my end of my contract then before I started at uni, I being the youngest person there's about 20 others in the company, I brought the conversation up. Well, guys, you posted the black square as an organisation that day. Why? What does that mean to you? As in, you posted it 3 months ago. Not once has that conversation arisen within our organisation. And I'm only a part 1, and I'm the youngest one here, but I don't want this conversation to be a person of colour, i.e. me, a brown person, having the conversation of race to a group of white people. I want you all to actually just sit down and discuss here, now we're all here, about what changes you've implemented, what it actually meant. And the honest answer that I got from everybody, including the CEO, was that we're not sure what to do. And they said, we posted it because we believed in it. And I said, okay, you believed in it, but in what sense did you believe in it? Because again, the conversation just wasn't around for the past 3 months. But yet you posted 3 black squares, in fact, so it matched the rest of your Instagram layout. And a lot of the conversation that came from that was actually the CEO who had said that, you know, this kind of very old school mentality, maybe not even old school, maybe it's just the mentality of majority of people within architectural practice, that, you know, if you're all in this organisation, you're all here because you're the best people, and I want everyone to leave their kind of problems at the door and essentially kind of be colourblind. And I then kind of said, that's not the way to look at this whole situation at hand. So I've actually got a question that I wanted to bring up is that when it comes to the current state of architecture now, and seeing who is in power and who are at the top of these organisations, how can you, as the Bartlett, because a lot of actually the colleagues and the CEO actually all went to the Bartlett, how can you outreach to those organisations and try to get them to understand that this is actually an important issue? Because it's all well and good doing it in school, but when it comes to actual practice, unless you're having those conversations internally, which I know many, many organisations will not be, or will not be doing it to the degree that they should be doing it, how can you help as an influential school where actually a lot of the students who are at the top of the architecture tree came from your school?
Thank you very much. I'm going to keep moving through to the next set of reflections. I'm going to take your question, not necessarily as a direct question for one of our panelists to answer, but if they want to, they're welcome to. It's more of a series of your reflections on a state of affairs of where we are and blockages that you've identified. Going through, Khalifa, you're next. Please can I ask you to try and keep your comment as brief as you can. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. Can you hear me? Hi. Well, firstly, thank you so much for that. I thought it was very insightful. I kind of wanted just to share a few things anecdotally and then probably pose a question to the whole panel. Firstly, just tell you a little about me. I'm a Black Muslim, Nigerian British, grew up most of my life here in the UK. And I remember just the other day having a conversation. I was thinking, God, it would be great if sinks were a little lower in the UK so I could do my ablutions easier. So it kind of gets me thinking about the different sort of degrees of sort of, segregation in the built environment as such. But yeah, and the other one was just, I was also reflecting on this idea of, Robert Moses and the low bridges he did that prevented buses going into the center of the city. Again, looking at the more urban design scale and how, race actually is quite a key issue there. And lastly, I just wanted to sort of so I actually founded an architectural practice here with 2 other colleagues a couple of years ago. And one of the reasons we did that was, after working in practice, we sort of found that it wasn't enough for us. It wasn't enough and we didn't think we can really bring about the change we wanted to see. And I noticed on the panel here, most of you are entrepreneurs as well. And I'm kind of curious as to why you've taken that path, despite, why did you feel you could have stayed in, you could have progressed through your careers in a normal standard practice, but yet you took the jump at one point. And what was that sort of key moment that you just felt, no, I just had to do this to really see the change happening? Yeah, so I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. Rachna, you're next. And again, please try to keep your comments as brief as you can.
Okay, hi. Thank you first, Kamna. It's just inspiring to have this conversation and this whole series of events. I just want to make 3 very short points. Firstly, I've worked as a consultant quite a lot in the Middle East and globally. And one of the things that strikes me, and we talk about as planners, is that how cities aspire always to be a London, to be a New York. And that image of the city, of what is London and what is New York, and how our practices that planning approaches to development that we take in London and New York, how are they universally good? Because no one talks about homelessness in London. No one talks about, access to housing, land markets, the troubles that we know exist in London and New York. So, and in fact, London and New York are so good that Western policies and approaches get kind of exported to countries, climates, cultures that are entirely different to these countries. So one of the examples is in India, there were a number of buildings that were designed to lead environmental standards, glass-cladded buildings in a tropical climate. They met the gold standard for LEED, but they were not climatically appropriate. So that's my first point. And the second point is my research, mostly from my research in Mumbai. My respondents often spoke to me about what colonialism did and what it achieved. And a lot of that glorification of colonialism was around the infrastructure it delivered. That look, 100 years on, it still works. The reason it still works 100 years on is because it was oversized, because it was Indian money going to British companies. So of course they'd oversize it, with a very exploitative regime. What people don't talk about is the segregations that a colonial city produced, that we as planners are very aware of, the colonial city for the urban elite and the unplanned city for the rest. Now, my question is that as long as we have the presence of overseas companies and Western approaches as superior, how do we overcome this dialogue about race? So I'm Indian. If I go from a London consultancy to my client, they'll be less happy than if there's a white colleague going and speaking to them. I mean, that's also there. And also, how do we at the Bartlett overcome this idea about race, and being sensitive to place, when we're trying to tell our students that the degree at UCL is by far superior, and with a degree at UCL, you can go and change the world because it's based in London. So how do we kind of bridge those tensions? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachna. I'd like to get to you and to Andrew as well. So please, no more than a minute, if you can just make your point as succinctly as possible. Thank you.
Yep, can you hear me? Yeah, it will be really quick. So my name is Awa. I am an alumni of the Bartlett, and this is a very layman question. So as someone who is not that, I don't know the details or the technicality when it comes to architecture and the architect career area or the career sector, but just growing up, and anecdotally, it was a career area that a lot of people saw as very, very white. And just again growing up, some of my friends who wanted to become architects, even if it doesn't matter how good their grades were, or they would always kind of just forget about that. They would be told not just by the schools, but by their families, and even within our communities, just forget about that. It's a very white person career, and I'm just asking, like, why you think that is. And it's not, I guess, because it's a professional job, because a lot of us have ended up in professional roles, whether it's in government or in the private sector, or as doctors or lawyers or whatever. But I don't know, architecture and the built environment kind of sector, it just, from the outside, and the perception is that it's just really white, and a lot of people don't like that, or they just are encouraged not to be part of that. And I was wondering why you think that is. That's it. Sorry. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Owe. Thank you for those reflections. We're going to stop there because I can see you've got no more hands up, and I'm going to turn to our panelists for their final thoughts before we stop at 2:30. So Neba, can I turn to you, please? Any final concluding comments you'd like to make?
Sure, thank you. Thank you all for your questions and contributions as well. It's been really interesting being on this talk. So I think I'd like to conclude with a few thoughts that are pulling on a few things that everyone has said, and also comments in the audience. So I'm asking myself, in this current environment of cities going through rapid urbanization and climate emergency, I think we all understand that we need to devise a method of teaching architecture so that we are able to change the outcome of what we are building, how our environment is being created. So we all know that regeneration needs to happen because of the numbers of people that are rising. We are becoming more. But we need to do that with our communities in mind, and with the people who are in need of more space. And I think some of the way that I feel like there are two ways to do that. In a way, you can work with communities to involve them in the design process. And I think the work that Resolve is doing is really amazing, working with young people in London, involving them in master planning or design processes. But then also, I think as a profession, we have a responsibility to ensure that we are diverse, that we are reflective of the society. And I think we all can do something towards that. And that's really great that you, I forgot your name, but you went to your workplace and said we have to speak about race. That's what you can do as a person. And I think that's extremely brave to do that in an office, which you said was probably pretty white. And to the comment of the lady that spoke earlier, the reason why our parents told us not to go into this profession is because it looks white, but because it is. So even if we're going into the profession and we're studying it, as I said before, we don't necessarily stay in it. And I think Resolve has been created, BFA has been created. Why? Because we didn't have a space for ourselves, so we had to create a space. And I think that's why people also think about, okay, I can't be in this office because it doesn't reflect the way I want to practice, so I will become an entrepreneur. I think that's somehow the last resolution that you do, but I think it's great. Please, everyone, create your own offices and let's make the change happen. So I think we have to create a shared environment that benefits the people that we're trying to serve. And taking London as an example, obviously, of the cultural diversity, we are obviously doing something wrong. So I think starting the diversification of our profession starts in architecture schools and looking at the curriculums really critically. And I think it's a great step that the Bartlett has made in this direction. I think we also need to look at the history that is taught in architecture schools. I mean, it's great to learn about, Parc de la Villette, but why aren't we learning about the great mosque of Jenny and Mali? Like, these are all things that have made architecture culture that we don't talk about. If we talk about culturally diverse or world architecture, it suddenly becomes primitive or vernacular, and that is a problem. We need to change the way that we're talking about these things. So I think we need to decolonize the curriculum really to be able to diversify the profession. And change our Eurocentric perspective, because our cities aren't Eurocentric anymore. Like, we are global, the world is changing, we are all connecting digitally, virtually. So we need to change the way we communicate architecture as well. And I think that starts in architecture schools by, you can take your students to a trip to Italy, great, but you can also take them to a trip to Accra. Look at one of our BFA members, Nana Biamo Fuzu's unit. She took her students to Ghana and they looked at the compound house. That's amazing. There's Professor Ola Oduku in Manchester who teaches African urbanism. There are people who have specialisms who are talking about world architecture, and I think we can all do things in that direction. And my final point, sorry, just to say, we also need to include our students in these conversations. So I think it's great that the curriculum has been made, but we need to be empathic towards our students and understand what their problems are. I think the top-down approach of creating a curriculum is great, but we need to really disseminate what do our students want and need and include them in these conversations. So talk to our students as well as making the change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Neva. Akil, can I give you 1 minute? Final comment.
I think I need any longer than a minute because Neba's really summarized everything I think that's needed to be said. I would only add that I think when we think of division, we also need to think about how we divide canonically, how we divide our disciplines, how we divide our methodologies, and that division is something that manifests as a result of the way that we think division and the way we imagine division. And for that reason, to divide and to kind of keep architecture within the sacred space with which we promulgate it, and that's been something that we've all witnessed it, or if you're in urban design or planning, we've witnessed a similar thing. And I think that we can deconstruct those divisions. So to deconstruct divisions of disciplines, I think is a really foundational way of thinking about how we then go to deconstruct and how we then go to kind of absolve and abolish the divisions that kind of propagate in society. I think that's kind of short and sweet in all I'd say.
Thank you very much. Hein?
Yeah, I'll be very short. I think, there is a question of choice and priorities. For us as researchers, what is the subject of our research? For you as students, what is the subject of your seminar paper? But I think that there is also an institutional level, and I'm happy that Christoph is here. What are we doing with our resources? How do we channel them? What are our priorities?
Perfect, thank you. Danna?
Thank you, and brilliant questions, and thanks for everybody's observations. There's a couple of things that I'd like to pick up on. So the question posed by Aru about why certain professions are deemed okay and not. Now that I've grown a little older, I think part of it in terms of our parents and that generation was thinking about our sort of psychological and financial sort of safety. I think there was a recognition that if we went into law, if we went into medicine, there were safer careers for us, and we were less likely to be sort of pushed away. Whereas in architecture, it was kind of seen as quite subjective, and maybe you wouldn't have a chance to kind of thrive and be everything that you could be. So that's just another perspective on it. I thought Khalifa's observations about bathrooms, it's so interesting how often inclusion becomes about the battle of the bathroom, from having segregated spaces based on race to having accessible or changing room areas as bathrooms. The whole debate around gender and where transgender and non-binary people can safely use. And, you know, there's something, it seems to be time and time again. So there may be an opportunity to kind of delve into that as a piece of work around how segregation works and sort of space and power. And I love the question from Faz about how the Bartlett could be working with its alumni. I think there are a number of different approaches, and I'm certainly not going to try and speak for the Bartlett, but I think that's a great idea, actually, to try not only to work with the students that are coming through, but also the ones that have been through before.
Thank you. Christoph, you get the last word.
So I feel like there's a lot of challenge and critique that's been raised today that kind of lands at on the lap of the Bartlett. You know, it's in our space. And I just want to share with you as the Dean that I value that challenge and critique. I appreciate it. I accept it. I think you're right to say everything that I've heard today from both our panelists and those who were asking questions and sharing comments. And what I would like to end with is just by letting you know that we are working in lots of different ways across many spaces, not just the curriculum. So it's not just what we teach, but also how we teach, who is doing the teaching, where we teach. Every aspect of who we are at the Bartlett, we are working on to be more diverse and more inclusive. And it's a long project, and I would love to share more details with you, but I think the key thing is please come back and join us for more events, more activity, more conversation, more debate, whether it's in our programs or classrooms, in public fora like this, or out in our exchanges in the world and in our professions.
Thank you. I'd just like to say thank you to all of our panelists for joining us today. Thank you very much to the audience for joining us today. And for those of you who posted in the chat, we've read them all with interest. And for those of you who spoke as well, thank you. I look forward to seeing you later on in the week for our upcoming events, or seeing you at some point later on in the week for the rest of our events. Stay tuned for the audio recording if you want to hear back some of the conversations we've been having. Thank you and goodbye.